JoJo's Bizarre Adventures is an old manga series, with the first issue being published in Shonen Jump on January 1st, 1987. And it's still running to this day, with part 8 of the manga series coming closer to conclusion in 2020. If you're not familiar with JoJo, you might be asking, how can one continuous story be told for over 33 years? Well, it's not one continuous story. JoJo is separated into parts, with each part featuring a descendant of Jonathan Joestar, the original JoJo of part 1. This is super cool because essentially each part is a brand new story with new characters, set in a new location and in a new time period. This keeps things super fresh and allows Araki to tell different types of stories. With this, he will also change the art style of the manga to better suit the story being told. Although each part is a different standalone story, these characters are related to one another, so there are certain characters that make appearances in multiple parts. This means that these characters go through an evolution in which their character designs change to accommodate the new art style. One of the most obvious examples of this is the character of Jotaro. He goes from super buff muki muscle guy in part 3 to a softer, slimmer, and overall more proportional character in part 4. This was quite a jarring change for some fans, with many people preferring the original Jotaro design over his design in part 4. But why? What's so unique about Jotaro's original design, and is this new design really that bad? This video is about Jotaro, but let's go all the way back to the original JoJo, Jonathan, and talk about his character design for a second. JoJo was first published in the 80s, which was a time in manga history in which the macho man physique was very popular. If you look at one of the most popular manga series of the 80s, Hokuto no Ken, or Fist of the North Star, you can see a lot of the artistic similarities to JoJo, particularly in the design of the male protagonist. Araki is also a huge fan of Western media and took inspiration from the action stars of the 80s, who all looked like this. So with that in mind, Araki started drawing JoJo and developed an artistic style which honestly was not super unique for its time and was actually kind of the norm. But Araki's style did develop, and he added his own flair to the macho man aesthetic. And by part 2, Araki's muscle man design became all about juxtaposition of masculinity and femininity. The famous Jojo Poses are inspired by female fashion model poses, and Araki dressed his male characters in revealing and provocative clothes, which traditionally wouldn't be worn by men, or straight men anyways. He also played with juxtaposition of personality and physique. Jonathan is a gentleman, a pure soul, and someone who wouldn't hurt a fly, and yet he is this ridiculous tank of a man. If you just gave someone an explanation of Jonathan's personality, I'm not sure if this is the body they would think of. His grandson, Joseph, is also blessed with the hunky Joestar gene, but unlike his grandfather, Joseph is a trickster and a very intellectual fighter who uses his mind more than his fists. Araki continues the muscle man trend in part 3, while making more adjustments, like including JoJo shoulders, where characters have these large octagonal shaped shoulders. And this is how the protagonist of part 3, Jotaro, was drawn in his manga debut. A big, thick, muscular guy with weird shoulders. But you're probably more familiar with this image. Jotaro's design is very cool. His outfit is a traditional Japanese school uniform in black. It's not as revealing or flamboyant as his predecessors, and the signature large chain hanging from his collar adds a sense of fashion, but it's still a very masculine accessory. He's also quite angular in his design, with his number 7 shaped cheekbones and his sharper eyes compared to the doe-eyed look of his grandfather. In terms of personality, Jotaro ends up being a pretty classic stoic cowboy type character. He doesn't say much, and when he does, it's usually when he's mad or when he's conveying his annoyance at the action of his fellow crusaders. This isn't surprising since Jotaro's design was heavily inspired by Clint Eastwood, an American actor who was featured in many westerns as the lone wolf cowboy, or the lone wolf cop. I like that Jotaro is a quiet guy, and I think that just because he doesn't express his emotions as much doesn't mean he doesn't have any feelings. I think Jotaro's character works well with the personality of the other Crusaders, and having him play nice with the rest of the guys and slowly open up to them is quite cute to watch. But to be honest, you kind of expect a character like Jotaro to be a buff guy. There's no juxtaposition between his masculine appearance and his personality. Jotaro is the least feminine JoJo. His clothing is very masculine, and even his Jojo pose is based off of this shot from Dirty Harry, starring, of course, Clint Eastwood. A new aspect to JoJo in part 3 was the introduction of stands. Araki could have infused some juxtaposition in Jotaro's character by making his stand more feminine, but we got Star Platinum, a straightforward, tough guy stand whose signature move is ora 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 ora, which is just to beat people up. Jotaro is a badass. Jotaro's hot. Jotaro is interesting in many different ways, but does his hyper macho body add much nuance or complexity to his character? I mean, it's kind of what you would expect. So if the JoJos of part 1 and 2 are about juxtaposition of masculinity and femininity, Jotaro from Stardust Crusaders is a full embrace of masculinity. And there's nothing wrong with that, it's just what it is. And I do think that's why a lot of people like Jotaro. He's just oozing with masculinity. Now let's move on to part 4, which takes place 11 years after the events of part 3. Jotaro was 17 in part 3, so now he is 28 years old and looks like this. Part 4 goes through the most dramatic transformation in terms of art style. Take a look at how Araki drew Josuke in the beginning of part 4 and here at the end. It starts off more similar to Stardust Crusaders, very angular, heavy shade details, more muscular bodies, but by the end, the art gets softer, curvier, and the characters in general get slimmer and more realistic in their proportions. When part 4 was adapted to anime, the style from the latter half of the manga was chosen, and I think this was the appropriate choice. In terms of the story, part 4 is the most realistic and grounded story in all of JoJo. The main story is about hunting down a local serial killer, not about saving the earth from vampires. The main JoJo of part 4, Josuke, is 16 in the story, 1 year younger than Jotaro in part 3. But Josuke and his friends look and act like real teenagers compared to Jotaro. In terms of appearance, Josuke is notably the first JoJo to leave the macho character mold. He's still very muscular, but he's not as bulky. He's much softer, and you get the impression that he's a young kid and still has some baby fat on him. Other characters also get a realistic makeover in part 4. Joseph, who was 18 in part 2, was 69 in part 3, but he acted just as healthy and fit as his teenage grandson. In part 4 though, at age 79, he's shown to be senile and hard of hearing. Joseph is no longer prancing around with his grandson and instead walks with a cane. Now, full disclaimer, Joseph is my favorite JoJo, and I'm not sure if this is how I wanted Joseph to end up, but it's a realistic portrayal of what happens to people as they get older. Jotaro gets the same sort of realistic makeover. He's no longer a child delinquent, but a responsible adult. He's not only responsible for himself, but for others as well. Jotaro is ready to get punched on Joseph's behalf when he tells Josuke about his parentage. Yeah, he still does yell at people sometimes, but he's generally much more patient and has mellowed out. Jotaro also has a real career. He's a marine biologist and a PhD candidate. All this bullshit with Dio is in the past, and he tells us that he hasn't had to use Zawardo and stop time for around 10 years. So essentially, since he left Egypt, he hasn't practiced stopping time. A lot of people get frustrated about this. If you have such a cool ability, why wouldn't you use it more frequently? But to be honest, it's pretty realistic that Jotaro wouldn't do this. We forget that in part 3, we only saw 50 days of craziness in Jotaro's life. And when that was over, he went back to normal life where he didn't have to fight an enemy stand every day or stop time at all. Jotaro's combat skills have definitely gone down because he hasn't had to fight for 10 years. But he has gained other skills which directly tie into his career. I know that Jotaro's battle against the rat is a controversial issue, but I think it was super cool that Jotaro got to show off his ability to track down an animal, a skill he probably uses in the field. Jotaro's always been quite an intellectual and analytical fighter, but as he's gotten older, he relies much more on his intellect. So this realistic development in his personality is accompanied by a change in his character design. He goes from cheese wheel shoulders to a regular dude. He's still very tall and large, but his quads aren't about to rip his pants off. Jotaro's outfit also changes as he, of course, no longer wears a school uniform and instead wears a white jacket and pants set with a matching hat, reminiscent of a white marine uniform, appropriate as he is a marine biologist, and is also reminiscent of maybe a white lab coat, again, because he's a marine biologist. He also has more colors in his outfit, a pop of pink, a splash of blue, very different from the all-black uniform that Jotaro wore in part 3. His accessory also changes from a thick chain to a little dolphin brooch. This is much more along the lines of how other JoJos dress. His face is also very different. This is probably one of the most jarring things about his character design. His distinct 7-shaped cheekbones are gone. He has a much softer and youthful look than in part 3. At first, this was off-putting for me. I thought Jotaro looked way too young. But then I realized I'm closer in age to Jotaro in part 4 than I am to Jotaro in part 3. And I look like a 13-year-old child. Although by part 6 I would have liked to see Jotaro with a more mature face, but this is a review of part 4, and I think at age 28 it's okay that he looks this young. And I do think that his softer features add to the overall feel that Jotaro has mellowed out. Now I could see a potential argument that makes Jotaro's new body slightly controversial, because suddenly Jotaro becomes a man of science, an intellectual, and now he's a skinny dude. Can't a renowned marine biologist look like this? And yes, it is super frustrating that Jotaro stopped training after Egypt, and therefore rather than being powered up, he was rusty. But I think this was a way for Araki to rein in the slightly overpowered Jotaro so that other characters can shine. After all, part 4 isn't even about Jotaro, it's about Josuke. We need to let Crazy Diamond have its moment. So, in conclusion, what are my thoughts? Which Jotaro is better? I want to point out that I don't think we talk enough about the representation of male bodies in media. And as JoJo fans, we might be used to this, but this is not how a normal body looks like. And yeah, it's just manga. Characters are allowed to have exaggerated features, but I think these features should serve a purpose. And to me, what makes the hyper macho bodies in JoJo interesting are the feminine poses and expressions these characters have, creating this interesting contrast. But Jotaro was never the expressive feminine JoJo, so his macho body just didn't really add anything for me. It's not like I hated Jotaro's body in part 3, but I'm okay with Jotaro moving on to a more realistic body, accompanied by his realistic character development. What do you guys think? I would love to know your thoughts.